Okay, welcome back to the afternoon section. This particular panel is covering a lot of territory. It's one project that is just wrapping up, another project that is in mid-flight, and then we're going to deal with some of the output from the first project, and then John Andrew here is going to be discussing the second. My name is Bruce Wilson. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Central Florida. I'm also an affiliate at CMI and a Law Transform affiliate. I've been with CMI for about 15 years now. And I was the PI for a very serendipitous project on the human right to water and sanitation. Does it make a difference to marginalized people's access to water? The reason it's serendipitous is because this passed into it became a standalone human right in 2010. And then after that, we had this period. So we have a period before, we have a single intervening moment, and then we have the period after. And we were really, really interested, not just about whether water rights affect the outcome of whether people have access or not, but generally speaking, whether or not human rights do. There was a lot of excitement when the right to water was created in 2010. And what we're trying to figure out is this just misguided, or is this something useful? If it's useful, how is it useful? How do we measure the outcome? So there's a whole bunch of people in the room here who are part of this project, and then some of the people on the panel here. This particular project has been really quite productive. It's produced almost 30 articles, one edited book, which Evelyn Villarreal will talk about, and 2 special issues of a peer-reviewed journal called Water, with a high impact factor that Akaja was the editor on one of them, along with Dan Brinks, who's in the audience here. And at least 3 babies were produced during this period, right? So there must be, as they say, something in the water that this point. This will be in my report to the Norwegian Research Council very shortly. So without further ado, so the first person to speak is Evelyn Villarreal, who is a researcher and the coordinator of the Estado de la Justicia in Costa Rica, and works at the Programa Estado de la Nación. The second person would be John Andrew McNeish, my compatriot here, from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and he's the leader of the Riverine Rights project at Oslo Met. Then we have Akaja Singh, who is the editor, as I just mentioned, the co-editor of the special issue on water and sanitation. And she works she's a researcher at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi, India. Then we have Catalina Viejo, who you just heard from a minute ago, who actually straddles both of these projects. She was part of the Water Rights Project, and she's now part of the Riverine Project. Then we have Jackie Dugard, who's from Columbia University. That's Colombia, not Colombia, just in case any of the Colombians here want to get upset about this. And Wits in South Africa, and she's going to be talking about her work on South Africa and the United States. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Evelyn. Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Could you pass me the remote? Oh, well, hello, everyone. First, I want to thank, of course, the support of the CMI and Law Transform, inspiring community led by Siri, for the opportunity to work in this project. This is supposed to be the slide that Bruce was talking about. And also, well, to the project leader, Bruce Wilson, for giving me the chance to contribute with my work. It's been a long journey since we started this project. Mainly was during the pandemic. But actually it ended up very well, because very timely, because Costa Rica just approved a constitutional reform to include the water right, the human right to water in the Constitution, and also is started a process to update our 80-year-old legislation on water. So it was very right timing to launch a book. This book has been a collective effort that I just have the honor to present here to you. Its main feature is that it was made by an interdisciplinary group of people, from junior and seniors, specialists on different areas of water. And also it had different quality controls during its elaboration, such as workshop and peer reviews. In addition to the book, we created different materials to share the findings with a broader audience. For example, podcasts, videos, blogs, and also it has a media coverage, very, very interesting. And it was part of the report that I coordinate, the State of the Justice report, that also has a national-wide media coverage. For the first time, this book presented a comprehensive study on the human right to water in Costa Rica that previously has been very segmented and mainly focused on environmental science. So you will see the 5 chapters here in the screen. I won't present the contents here. They are a very complex chapter each, which its own methodology and story, so it would be really hard to summarize. But rather, I will focus on the next minutes on some selected provocative findings, hopefully to encourage you for your feedback. So let's start with the very first idea. This historical high compliance in Costa Rica comes in parallel to the democratic welfare state building process. That's the very first idea that I want to show you. And if you see Costa Rica in the 60s, in the 1960s, only half of the population had access to drinking water. And this improve accordingly at the same time with the building of the democratic welfare state, with a package of other social services such as electricity, health, education, social security. Water services were part of that basic public services that the population got with this democratic welfare state. At the point that today we have 98% of the population with drinking water coverage. And all the comparative data, international comparative data, the country places among the best of the practices. But there's always a but. There are gaps within and among income groups, as you can see in this graph, and I will come back later to this. Also, there are territorial gaps in the country, and it depends on the provider. And as you can see, each dot in this map, it's one provider. There are more than 3,000 providers of drinking water in this very, very small country. It's a model that mixes local government providers, community private providers from the small communities, and also two very large state companies provider of drinking water. If you see the blue dots in the center, where is the capital, it's the national institutions which have more quality of drinking water, and the orange and the red ones are community-based providers, and there are very big community providers and very micro providers just for a bunch of families. This improving coverage of basic water was along with the existing legislation and the increasing legislation as well. Most of the principles that we have came from the 1942 legislation. That's why I told you that it's 80-year-old right now. It's our general law in water, and the country has been able to update it right now. But instead of updating the general legislation, what we have done is to approve almost 275 different legislations related to water. Some more specific public policies and strategies are very, very recent, just from the last decade. One of the main problems that still remain is on sanitation. On sanitation, we have much worse indicators than these ones. And also, since the creation of the Constitutional Court, as you can see in this graph, some cases related to water were solved by this court. And especially there were, at the beginning of the court, they were very open about this right, and they established the obligation to put a public free water source in communities that cannot afford to pay for the service. So that led me to the second main idea. Why the human right to water was important if we already had constitutional rulings and laws and a very high coverage? Well, it's mainly because more recently, water dispute had increased a lot in the country due to a very disorganized urbanization process and also climate change. Water disputes are growing. This is made from a database on social mobilization in the country since the 90s. It's a 30 years mobilization story, where almost 60% of the environmental disputes, social disputes, are related to water. The main causes are cuts, polluted water, and communities that oppose to economic projects competing for the same water. The book also has some case studies on the main conflicts. For example, this map shows you the conflicts in the red areas, the conflicts against dam projects, which it's a very big issue in Costa Rica since 90% of our electricity comes from water sources. During the pandemic, several social conflicts got worse and emerged, especially related to health issues, health rights. And these conflicts, of course, some of them, you can see them in the pictures, never occurs in the rich neighborhoods. They occurs in very populated and marginal neighborhoods. They combine street blocking with also legal or judicialization of the human right to water. When they judicialize the human right to water, they go to the Constitutional Court, which is our human rights tribunal. And this is the third main finding that I wanted to show you. And the research that we made in the book, there is a chapter on judicialization of human right to water, and it was based on the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court of 30 years. It's almost 500,000 resolutions that we process and analyze with data science tools to find that around 5,000 resolutions were water related. And as you can see in this graph, from these 5,000, only 30% were successful. So 70% of them are rejected by the court, which led us to the question, well, what happened with this 70% that didn't get a in favor resolution for the court for the access to human rights? And there, mainly there is a tension in the constitutional resolutions or the jurisprudence between treating the water as a public service or as a human right. And that the outcome will be totally different, depends on the framing that you are using, especially when it becomes a dispute, a social dispute or a community dispute. If it is a public service, it's subject to institutional capacity, is budget availability, requirements, legal and technical requirements. Also, you have to wait a long time. There's a queue to have access to water at home. But if it is a human right, if the resolution framed it as a human right, especially related to other rights like health rights or the right to live, it could be fast-tracked, and then the Constitutional Court can act. It's like this water case can go to the emergency room, or it could wait for an especially doctor's appointment, and that's the tension that is in the Constitutional Court resolutions. But there is another and a third framing, I will say, that this is very recent, and is if the water has its own rights. And the Constitutional Court just got 2 cases, but they are still pending to solve. So it would be really interesting to see how they're framing this, the whole lecture. So, well, this is the final slide. I will stop with this quote. It was from Leo Hiller that wrote the prologue of the book. And I think it summarizes a little bit what I am trying to explain. And it's that human rights lenses allow us to have a more comprehensive understanding of what is happening with the water, the human right to water, and also more complex challenges arrive, and beyond this national average that is not very useful, also exhibits the practical and the legal gaps within the Costa Rica successful story. So that will be it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, just whilst the slide is coming up. Yeah, sure, no problem. Let me just say, before I introduce you to the project that I'm working on, that the book that Evelyn and Bruce has produced is really excellent. We made very good use of it, in fact. I run a field course on political ecology in Costa Rica every year. And this year we had a focus on water politics in the country. So the book actually fitted extremely well with what we were intending to do. And not only was it of use for us as a group of foreign academics and students coming from abroad, from the US and from Norway, but it was also very useful as well for the movements and communities that we came into contact with in the Teraba Valley. So where we had contact with different movements there who are concerned about water resources and in an area where there's very heavy agro industry around pineapple production, and also contact with indigenous communities in that area. So, I mean, it's probably no surprise to you that the book is of value to them, but they certainly emphasized how important this book was. And so on to what I want to introduce. Let me just say, first of all, as well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to see old friends here as well. I don't come back to Bergen so often. It seems to be once a year these days. I work at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, which is based at Ås. It has a location about half an hour south of Oslo. The Norwegian University of Life Sciences has a history as Norway's agricultural school, but has also now become a university with a very strong emphasis on essentially environmental and biosciences. So most of my colleagues at the university are natural scientists, engaged in different forms of natural science research in Norway, but also across the world. And I belong to a small faculty within the university that really has an interest in social sciences. And the thought with us is that we act as a bridge, as it were, between natural sciences and the social sciences and the humanities. And so we are an interesting collection of people who work in that way. I have a background as an anthropologist who has worked principally around questions of environmental politics and resource extraction in the context of Latin America. And so over the last 10 years, that's really the direction of my work, has been working with extractive politics, specifically looking at conflicts, micro-level conflicts that occur in different contexts around Latin America. But as a good anthropologist, I'm also been involved in many different things. And so this project fits with that many different things in terms of my broader interests with environmental politics. So the project Riverine Rights, Exploring the Currents and Consequences of Legal Innovations. This is a project that has been funded by the Norwegian Research Council, started in 2020, of course, during the pandemic, which had some implications for us in terms of how fast we could get going with the project, slowed us down, particularly with regards to field research. And I'll say more about the importance of field research in a minute. But we have been running since 2020. We'll run for 4 years. You can see also the project website, the link there, if you're interested to learn more about us. We are a project about riverine rights. When I say riverine, I mean of the river. This is not about rivers. It is about everything that is connected or relationships to the river. It is something more than just the river or the water. So we're actually focused on a set of rulings, all of which started out in, no, it's okay. All of which, I know it's different, it's okay, don't worry. All of which were introduced in 2017. These are rulings which were introduced in 3 different contexts in Colombia, India, and New Zealand. And these are rulings not on the right to the river. These are rulings on the rights of the rivers themselves. Now, for some of you, that's going to be really easy to accept. That's not going to be a problem for you to get your head around. For others, it's going to be a problem. You're going to really resist that. And that's one of the things that we really recognize working with this, is that some people have no problem. There's an immediate acceptance to that understanding that rivers have their own rights. And then others reject it. They have problems accepting it. So that's important to get over. It's about the rights that the rivers themselves have. Now, these rulings are not necessarily in tension with human rights as such, but what you will also would be very evident once you start looking at them is that there is nonetheless a frustration with human rights. That human rights, and particularly an anthropocentric focus of human rights, is a problem, and it limits us. And so these rulings are in large degree meant to go beyond that. Now, when I'm talking about the rights of rivers and the rights of nature, I'm not trying to sell you something either. I'm actually very agnostic about this. I'm not evangelical. Many of the other projects out there that deal with the rights of nature or deal with the rights of rivers are very evangelical. They're going to sell you a line that you should believe this. I'm not so sure. I'm not convinced yet. So as a good researcher, I need a little bit of time to make my mind up about this. I think there's something really important in this, and yet there are also, what we're actually uncovering is that there are also some complications. So what I want to do now is to introduce a bit the project, talk a little bit about the background to these ideas, and then talk a little bit about the challenges and complexities, if I get enough time to do that, all in 9 minutes and 50 seconds. So we are focused on 3 different contexts. We're looking at the Trato River in Colombia. We're looking at the Ganges, Narmada, and Yamana rivers in India, and the Wanganea River in New Zealand. These are all contexts of rulings on the rights of rivers, all of it which were interestingly introduced in the same year, in 2017. And since then, there has been the inspiration, the precedent, for many, many other cases across the world. And so we're now actually seeing cases on the rights of rivers, but also on the rights of other natural features, or the rights of nature more broadly speaking, in multiple contexts across the world. In Colombia alone, there are now 18, 19 cases like this, but we're also seeing cases, for example, in Bangladesh, a ruling on all the rivers of Bangladesh. We're seeing rulings such as in Panama, the US, Canada, and Spain, again on particular features, as well as on more broadly the rights of nature, more broadly speaking. This is also a matter of discussion in constitutional processes. So we can also recognize that, for example, in the effort to build a new constitution in Chile, this has also been a focus of that process as well, the rights of nature. We are a team as well that is very interdisciplinary in background. We're a team of principally anthropologists and legal scholars. Catalina is one of them who's with us. And Catalina, when it comes to legal questions, can answer you much better than I can as an anthropologist. But we are an interdisciplinary group that believe that context matters and that going there matters, right? This is not a matter of just doing studies on a macro level, but actually going there reveals a lot. Spending time in the, around the river, experiencing the river as a phenomena, but also talking to the people who live around those rivers and relate to the rivers reveals so much more about what those rivers actually really are. What is a river? Think about what that might be. We are working with different institutions in each of these national contexts. So we in Aotearoa in New Zealand, we are working with the University of Canterbury, and particularly with Elizabeth Macpherson, who's one of the leading writers on these questions of the rights of nature and rights of rivers. We are, I'm actually not the project leader, although I was introduced as such. My project leader is a guy called Axel Borchgrevink, who works for Oslo Met University, is also an anthropologist. He's also working in New Zealand. We're working with Miriama Cribb. What's important about Miriama is that Miriama is a member of the iwi, that is the member of the tribe that actually relies on the Wanganea River. And so we have a very strong sense as well of trying to build a more co-productive strategy in research with the local communities and trying to sort of embed the research into local institutions and also try and have a quid pro quo kind of relationship where we both can learn from this and gain something. We're working in India, where we have a postdoc working at Oslo Met, Rahul Ranjan. We're also working with the Tata Institute of Social Studies in India with a guy called Bibu Nayak. And Catalina and I are responsible really for the case of the Atrato in Colombia. So we're a diverse group in that sense. Let's see if we can move this on. So we have different aims in the project. We are trying to look at these different cases in these three national contexts and try and to reveal something new about what's going on. So first of all, we are very interested in the mechanisms established for enforcing river protection for different user groups. That means that we're looking at really the governance consequences of the rulings, the formation, for example, of guardianship committees, committees of experts, studies of toxicology, legal decisions as well to clean up the river, and perhaps also, and here we could talk specifically about the context of Colombia, to deal with the illegal use of these rivers. And in all contexts, there is illegal use of these rivers, creating further complexity. We are also looking at the implications for existing legal frameworks and debates on the rights of nature. And in that regard, we are somewhat conscious of the fact that there's a history to these ideas of granting rights to rivers. So although the trend of recognizing the natural world or features of the natural world as legal persons or as legal subjects, that this is something relatively new. The idea of actually stretching law to non-humans is something that has a long history, right? Most of you, if you have a legal background, you'll recognize this very clearly. We can take this back to Roman law and the way in which the Roman law also created fictions, legal fictions, in order to, to provide also ideas of ownership. Similarly, also in mercantile history, thinking about, for example, the history of corporate law, the operation of the East India Company, there were also, the corporation is also a fiction, a legal fiction, which is granted laws as though they were subjects or persons. There's a history as well here, clearly as well, of quite innovative, progressive legal thinking, stretching back particularly to the work of Christopher Stone back in the 1970s, where the argument simply put was that nature had its own moral standing. So his famous work on That Trees Have Standing is about the fact, the recognition that nature should be recognized as having its own moral standing. Here we also should recognize the work as well of the Chilean scholar, Godolfo Stutzen, also writing in the 70s and 80s, where he shared very much Christopher Stone's views, but also pushed that further, and particularly as a critique of the anthropocentric basis of law. And here really what we're looking at is the basis, or the foundations, the origins of what we might call more ecocentric law coming out of the 70s and 80s. So, and then third, we're looking at the insights that these cases might offer for current debates about how to understand and govern the relationship between society and the natural world. There is, of course, now a transnational movement supporting the ideas of the rights of nature. There's an international tribune on the rights of nature, a global alliance on the rights of nature. There are organizations such as International Rivers, Earth Law Institute, etc., all pushing this line, this understanding of the rights of nature. There's an influence clearly here as well from recent legal reform and constitution in places such as in Latin America. Here thinking about the constitutional processes that have taken place in Ecuador, but also thinking about legal change that has occurred in contexts such as Bolivia. Here, there's commonly also a reference as well to the long-standing cultural ontologies and protocols of indigenous peoples. In fact, in all of these cases, it would appear to be, at least the cases that really hold value, there is a connection quite clearly to local indigenous peoples, their claims for rights, but also their understandings of the natural world. An understanding of the natural world where, at least commonly as a stereotype, there's this understanding that culture and society is not separate from nature. It is intimately entwined. Here, we can also connect as well understandings as well of biocultural rights, and with that also connect as well to more recent debates in social analysis, social theory, on post-humanist thought, on decolonialism, etc. So there's a lot that's packed into this as a background. So I said I wanted to just I would end as well with talking a little bit about challenges and complexities, because as I said, I'm an agnostic about this, and I see that there's value to this, but there is also some really big changes, big challenges. First of all cases are not necessarily alike, right? So a legal subject and then a legal person, these are two different things. Rulings are also taking place at different levels of the legal scale. They're taking place at the local level in municipal ordinances, they're taking place at state level, or they're taking place at the level of constitutional courts. We also recognize that there are major problems in terms of political realities. Think about trying to implement the right of a river, such as the Trato River, in the context of Colombia, a country that is riven with problems of violence and has been for a long period of time. The Trato River itself is in the Choco region of the country, a region which has major problems with illegal actors, illegal mining, with problems of major poverty and social discrimination, and also a long history as well of structural racism and violence as well against the ethnic populations there, the Afro-descendant population or the indigenous population. There are also major complexities with the geographies. We're talking about watersheds which are enormous. They're enormous watersheds. So these are areas, they're not just the river, it's everything that relates to the river. There are issues as well here, as well with indigenous, sort of the effort to try and reduce indigenous identity as well as one that's only about the protection of the natural world. The reality of indigenous peoples is much more complex than that. And they also as a reality, or as well as their experience of colonialism, have also very often been forced to take a much more pragmatic relationship to nature, to reduce them to the noble ecological savage, as very often writings on the rights of nature or the rights of rivers is very, very problematic. And last of all, it's about the limits of law. You know, here there are major limits to law in the sense that you might get a ruling on the rights of a river or the rights of nature. But what's interesting is that the river itself does not have the right to its own water. So none of these rulings do anything about, for example, as you suggested, the understanding of a right to water. The river does not have its own water. So there are major problems with that regard in terms of dealing with, for example, both legal and illegal actors. So very problematic indeed. So we're seeing that there are complexities to these ideas that we have to also dig away at.
Is the mic on?
Yes.
Yeah. So Bruce, I think, briefly introduced the project and the edited special issue, but I'm going to talk about both the paper that we all jointly co-authored, Dan, Bruce, and I, and the project, and in an interrelated sort of way. So first of all, it was fantastic to work with this group of scholars from so many countries. On this, we had a question about the impact of the right to water, and this group and this project group brought not just regional diversity, but a great diversity of vantage points from which to look at the right to water and its impacts. And also, which was very kind of satisfying for me, was that there was a fascinating level of detail and specificity about the work that came from different places, and that was, it was very, very, very rich. And this collection of articles, which I wish we had a photo, but I think that we should have had a photo of the up, but it's an open source collection, and there should be a printed version of it out soon as well. So this collection speaks to the multiple forms, uses, and mobilizations of the right to water, and it also speaks to global rights more generally, and provides a different perspective on the use and impact of global rights. So, our paper was titled "The Decentered Construction of Global Rights: Lessons from the Human Right to Water." And what does it mean when we say the construction of global human rights is radically decentered? What we mean by this is that it's built of many processes, myriad struggles, claims of people who feel struggles all over the place, so many different kinds of processes. The places where the construction of global rights is happening goes beyond what we consider the centers of international legal development. And it's often, those places might have only a very tenuous or even episodic connection with those centers. The range of actors involved in this process are not just legal actors, not just the people who we conventionally think of as legal actors, and most interestingly, the production of meanings. So what the right to water actually means, and what its kind of content and specificity should be, also changes. So rather than trimming the claims to fit, this is the claim we make, is that rather than trimming claims to fit the shape of the right, so rights as a disciplining process, rather than that, it's the other way around, and people kind of stretch and reshape the right to fit their requirement. And these sort of extra legal law outside the conventional idea of rights construction is most likely to happen when the existing legal frameworks don't meet the needs of rights claimants. So this collection of articles that we built on, one of the things that was, two of the articles closely studied constitutionalizing processes. Siri and Mattia, and then Lara, Camila, Angela. Can you give me some more water? It's very hot on the stage, Yes. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, so this Lara, Camila, Angela, and Catalina, their work brought out how much of, so in the constitutionalizing process, the importance of domestic actors, even where international actors are present, there's quite a strong role that domestic actors play, and a lot of it is the interests of those domestic actors and the sort of dynamics of the domestic situation, which determines how much, the outcomes or the outcome of this constitutionalizing kind of churn can be quite unpredictable. It can also depend, when you look at it from this perspective, it's how much of a claim is that right? How much would it change the existing status quo? And so how challenging is the constitutionalizing of this right? We found, however, that in a lot of the places where the right to water is not constitutional, because it's so fundamental, and because it's there anyway, even if it's not explicitly constitutionalized. So a lot of courts have to recognize this right in various ways, because water is life. And the norm development around the right to water happens in all kinds of, drawing on the right to health, drawing on the right to environment, drawing on all sorts of things. This norm development is happening all the time. And to look for where it's happening, it's worthwhile to look not just at the formal structure of norm development, but also where it matters most. So, in Namita Wahi's paper, she talked about the marginalized groups, the Dalits and the indigenous people, and their struggles, the way their particular exclusion and the particular challenges that they face. So there's a specific kind of law that deals with the kind of restrictions that Dalits might have faced with regard, or the discrimination, the violence that they might have faced with regard to their access to the right to water. For indigenous people, they've made a more ambitious claim in some ways, in a natural resource way, to say, land, forest, water, and it was ours. That's been less successful, but that doesn't mean it's less important in the idea of norm creation. In Jackie's work on, which she'll talk about, I'm sure, but in the context of Day Zero, when people were asked to talk about the right to water, it was not only the legal right to water that they were talking about, but inequities and injustices that they faced on a daily basis, which was outside the frame of that right to water. In my work, in my article in that special issue, I've talked about the urban informal settlements in India, which are in some ways islands of relative deprivation. Not that the situation is excellent outside, but it's a bit worse in the informal settlements. And, I tried to understand in my paper why this was, the kind of the technical reasons why these islands of deprivation existed, and how people, what they used to kind of formulate their claims and negotiate their way around this situation. There's also Inga's work on the working class communities in the American towns, where also the right to water didn't have a formal legal recognition. The courts have repeatedly rejected it. And even then, it has a kind of argumentative power, a power to bring people together, and a point of reference around which people can mobilize. Which is a way to say that the legal actors don't always have the last word on the meaning of the right. So, where legal frameworks are restrictive, such as, in the Indian context, where we were talking about drinking water being linked very much to your being able to make a claim to land. So in situations like that, it didn't speak to the living situations, and it didn't speak in a practical way to the living situations of people who were being denied water. And so, they went outside that legal framework. They went to a different framework, which... So urban slum residents then engaged directly with municipal bureaucrats who built a structure of access of rights that, that they use engineering concepts and they use service delivery concepts, but it rests on the normative idea that everyone must have access to the water they need for their basic needs. So, where does the right to water necessarily encompass equity and justice? Sometimes it could be that, the Indian courts had recognized the right to water. So the Indian, at the sort of discursive level, the High Court had recognized that there's a constitutional right to water, which is drawn from the right to life, but it didn't, speak to the actual situation where people were, the situation that people actually faced. The right to water is also, there's an interesting, I said this applies generally, but there's an interesting, very interesting to me, water-specific dimension, which came out in the work. It came out particularly in the work of Lara and Anna, but also, in mine and in Jackie's, was the how the right to water is shaped and reshaped around the discourse of economic pricing and privatizations. And where there is this, this whole legal institutional service delivery architecture, then you can assume that there'll be a lot of litigation. And, the sort of tension between the water governance frame or the regulatory and economic logic of water, and how it has to necessarily then be challenged, mobilizing the right to water. It almost seems like it would happen. So where this framework is less developed as in India, we see less of this kind of argument being made, but where it's more developed, we see, that argument is much sharper and much more clear. There was another paper which also pointed out that water rights litigation, I suppose something John said too, is increasing. The water rights research is very multidisciplinary, and it includes engineers and political scientists and geographers, and along with legal scholars. And this, I think, suggests something about how rights should be, our rights are coming to be understood. So then what is the use? I mean, one of the, we set out with this question of what is the use of an international right, and what does the right to water need to be recognized separately? The right to water is also in its specific, international formulation. It's been criticized as being something in aid of the neoliberal reframing of water. So it was very careful to not exclude privatized water, for example, in the, especially in the context of the debates that happened at that time, or is it, in aid of human welfare, as it was put out to be? A lot of this critique, a lot of this debate is about that international and legal construction of the right to water. And what we are saying in this project is that the process of right creation is actually much more diffused and dialectical. And the right set work frame is a useful one, but also that it happens in many different venues simultaneously and asynchronous, in different ways, sometimes at different stages. Some things are more active than others. So it's lots of different venues and lots of different kinds of actors and contexts. That the results of this are naturally unpredictable. Not all claims and not all formulations are as successful. They're not, of course, so this is, it emerges from this loosely connected and decentered process of appropriation and deployment of the language of rights in different kinds of political struggles. So yeah, I'll just skip some of my notes because I'm running out of time, and I wanted to make 2 other points. Yeah, so I wanted to say a little more about the spaces, and about, we know that there is a kind of constitutional space, a legal space. We are also quite aware of the political space, and obviously a right that is so social, so fundamental will have a social space. But what the work on the right to water brought out is the technical expert domain and the bureaucratic dimension. It was quite important. And we thought about this quite a lot, within the water rights group, about whether this was, whether this was something specific to the right to water, whether it was about water that it is so, there is this bureaucratic domain where things are being kind of interpreted and negotiated, whether it's something that's actually about all rights, because all sorts of rights, including negative rights, need a bureaucratic, have a bureaucratic dimension, which is very important to realizing or implementing that right. So, in some ways this, and the last thing I wanted to say is about, some of the earlier writing on the right to water, and we see this about the writing on the right to water in India, is this, that the right to water has been recognized by the courts, but it is not meaningful because its content has not been specified. And so we need this kind of right to water law, just as we have a right to food law or a right to different types of laws. And I think this work, so now I'm talking about the impact of the project on me, which is, in the way that it kind of changed my understanding, is that there is a tension between, because the moment you demand this specification, it's also limiting. So you need, of course, that institutional framework. The countries that have a more precise institutional framework for water service delivery, of course, have, there is a framework. You can, lobby that framework, you can challenge that framework, you can do all of that. Whereas when you don't have it, there's a little bit of this vacuum where you have to negotiate with the local municipalities. But it's also limiting because some claims, no matter what you do, some claims or some types of claims and some types of issues will necessarily fall out of scope. And then have you given up the argumentative power of the right in a more general sense? And this came home to me during the pandemic, where, at the time of the pandemic, I looked at the operation of the food security law on people, poor workers in India who were affected by the pandemic and not being able to eat. And even though the right to food law had been the result of, the work of many activists, and, it had a very, there was a lot of work that went into creating this, and it's had huge and beneficial impacts on a lot of people. But what ended up happening was this was a situation the right to food law could not deal with. But the sort of the power to interpret the right to food had been taken into that law. So, by that law, the government was already granting it. And so I think, is it useful then to also think of how you can have the legal framework for that, for the institutional service delivery aspect of it, but the broader claim of the right should be in conversation with that service delivery, but not, this is just about advocacy of rights, to not give up the broader meaning or the broader conception of the right, and therefore not give up its kind of claim making or argument making power.
Thank you, Akaja. Katarina?
Thank you all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two contributions to this human right to water project, and then try to make a very brief comment about the rights of rivers, or the rights of water bodies and everything around them, and our right to water. So the first contribution was a paper that I wrote with my colleague Angela Paez. She's a Colombian scholar based at Tennessee State University. And we were, we had the curiosity from this project about did the UN resolution on the human right to water in 2010 inspired any changes in our constitutional and law and in our legal framework and regulations or not? Did more people in Colombia get access to water after this resolution? Does it make any difference or not? So what we did was we decided to focus on Congress. So to see, first of all, how the legislative was dealing or channeling, which is the title of the paper, channeling water conflicts through the legislative branch in Colombia. And for this, we did a systematic content analysis of all bills and proposed constitutional bills after 91, which is the year where we had a new constitution, a new set of fundamental and social rights, and access to justice mechanisms. So after 91, we used the database of Congress that is available publicly online, and we looked for every legal or legislative document on water No, what were the political parties or the representatives in Congress proposing, and how was this voted, and what were the debates, and what happened? 2 hours surprise, nothing had happened. I didn't think we were going to find nothing because for many reasons, because the Constitution is very rich in social rights provisions, because the tutela action and popular or collective litigation mechanism was in use. I was really working. So and water is such an important topic everywhere, and Colombia is rich in water and it's full of social environmental conflicts. So this was supposed to be a very important topic for litigation or for legal reform, but it wasn't. So we were very puzzled by this finding. So what we saw was, we tried to see which bills were proposed by whom and on which kind of topics. And our conclusion is there were some bills proposed, but not on any fundamental issues around water, and very depoliticized anyway. Not touching upon the fundamental problems of distribution, of inequality, of budget decisions on public budget, things like this. And we saw that many of the political parties had proposed bills. So it was not only the Green Party or the Liberal Party, but it was also the Conservative Party and many others were. So water was a topic that everyone was more or less involved with, but not to any special degree. And then, so we were disappointed about that. But then through interviewing different actors, we found another surprise, which was that, okay, through the legislative function, the Colombian Congress has not been channeling water conflicts that exist for sure, not channeled through this way, but through its political control function, they have done interesting things. So they have helped holding to account different members of government, ministers, people in power over licensing of extractive projects, big licensing or big licenses that involve risk to water sources, or for which communities, farmers, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants have mobilized. So this was another surprise. It's an interesting surprise for us. It's not, we cannot say that in every case it works well, no? So it also depends on the case. So we saw that bigger cases that were really affecting the public opinion on the government, for example, or on, I don't know, a corporation, where then reached a point where the people paid attention to them in Congress. But then it was probably too little, too late, no? So also depending on where in the country this project was based, who is mobilizing there, what are the political actors there, the important people there, then there were better chances for them to get, through political control hearings in Congress. So it's certainly not for everyone, certainly not all the time, and certainly not in all the cases where there are important conflicts related to water. So this is more or less what we found in that project with Angela. The second contribution was on constitutional reforms to include the right to water in comparative perspective. So with my colleagues Lara Cortés, Camila Janela, and Angela Paz, we looked into Colombia, Peru, and Brazil to see if after this 2010 resolution, anything happened in these three constitutions. The three countries are quite different, of course, but also share some things, some similarities. So they all have portions of the Amazon, they all are rich in water, they all have social conflicts, strong diversity and inequality, social inequality, and they were all part of this the wave of new Latin American constitutionalism, so rich constitutions in terms of rights, some more than the others, but anyway. And at the same time, this wave of neoliberal reform in the 90s as well, where so now we had all these beautiful rights, but at the same time, the state had a less important function in society, was leaving more of the public services to private actors and just staying behind as a regulator mainly. So water was part of this. So it became a public service for the private corporations to supply, which is very wonderful for them to have a human right to water because they have to provide for everyone. But of course, there are costs involved, and not everyone in deeply diverse and unequal societies can pay for access to water. Not everyone lives in an apartment building. Not everyone lives in a house. Many people in different communities live in many different ways. And not, so if, yes, so there are like these two aspects to the right to water. One more individual, liberal, if you like, when through having a house, the right to housing, you have water, piped water. And the other one is a more collective aspect where as a collective, as a polis, we all need access to water in equal access, good quality, but also this water doesn't come from the pipe. This water comes from the rivers and the cycle of water. And so if the natural resources, if the water bodies are polluted by other things like mining projects and yes, pollution, then the human right to water, the liberal or individual aspect is also problematic. So we saw in the two cases, we had these similarities and these shared problems. And we thought, okay, what happened? What are the facts? The thing is, Peru passed, so the three countries had many attempts of constitutional reform to include the right to water in the constitution. Peru passed a reform, while Brazil and Colombia haven't. Maybe they will, but so far, no, hasn't worked. The constitutional courts have, as Evelyn and Arcadia said, already in case law, through case law, said that individuals have a right to access water even in the event when they cannot afford fees, in connection with the right to life and the right to health. But this other more collective aspect is not really that much developed, although there are some cases, but not much developed. That's why the activists and the social movements really believe that there is a need for constitutionalization. So our findings, very briefly, are that we saw in the three countries very different legal opportunity structures. So while in the three countries it's difficult to pass constitutional reforms, it is more difficult in Peru. And Peru is the one that passed the reform. But in Peru, it's more difficult to implement such a reform, because it's not that easy to access justice or to have access to constitutional justice in a more informal and free way, while in Colombia and Brazil, this has been this is different. And the authorities know that if there is a ruling, they will need to, they will be overwhelmed by litigation to tell us, and they will need to somehow respond. And they don't have the budget to respond. So different legal opportunity structures mean that including the human right to water in a constitution doesn't necessarily mean that this will be implemented, but maybe it's just, to keep things cool, while in places where the opportunity structures are higher, the struggle for inclusion in the constitution might be more difficult, but once it gets there, there might be more opportunities. Thank you.
I can see that that's 1.29 minutes over.
Thank you, Jackie.
Okay. Thanks. So I am actually going to, for me, I want to be an advocate for rights as being disruptive. So I'm going to actually not talk about the article that I wrote for the special issue, as fantastic as that special issue was. But I think that Arkaja and Catalina have wonderfully set out the groundwork there. I'm going to talk about an article that I wrote, part of Bruce's project, but it's different. So this article looked at legal mobilization, water rights mobilization in Johannesburg and Detroit around racialized water disconnection. And what I sought to do in this article, which has just been published in the Journal of Human Rights Practice, is I sought to take a provocation from one from Stuart Scheingold and one from Michael McCann. And the first from Stuart Scheingold is that most of the studies on rights or the value of rights tend to be court focused. And the provocation I took from Michael McCann is that most of there are actually not all that many empirical studies looking at the value of rights. They tend to be rather sort of normatively position taking, either from the left or the right. Rights are useless because they're domesticating, etc., or etc., etc. So I decided to do an empirical study of the value of rights, not looking at the courtroom processes. And how did I do this? I decided to look at 2 losing cases around water rights mobilization. So this is the only water rights case that's ever come to the Constitutional Court in South Africa, the case of Mazibuko. And then it's the water rights case that's been taken in the city of Detroit called LIDA. So I looked at the legal mobilization around water rights disconnections in both of these cases. And I went to speak to the people who'd been involved in the mobilization themselves, the activists, the lawyers, the community organizations, to ask them, against the backdrop of these losing cases, the one in Johannesburg and the one in Detroit, whether rights were, whether they had effectively abandoned rights because of this experience of having lost in court. And what I found was really pretty astounding. And it's, in retrospect, and you'll have to take my word for it that I didn't go in there with a theory. I just spoke to people first. And then in retrospect, I realized that what it did was confirmed the idea about the power of rights and some of the things that Arkaja was talking about, not the non-instrumental power of rights, the more symbolic. Some people call it symbolic, but I think it goes way beyond that. And in fact, for me, what I found was the most useful retrospective way to analyze what came out from the activists themselves was tweaking a model from development studies about the power cube, about different ways that power operates. So what I found, effectively, if one looks at, and I don't know if people here are familiar with the power cube, but it's basically got power to, power with, power within, and power from, which I'll just briefly go through. And sorry, it doesn't have power from, I added that. So power to is the ability to act. And for sure, that water rights, and by the way, here, because it was about the international right to water, this project, I specifically, in the Detroit case, specifically, what is really interesting here is that there is, of course, no right to water in the US, and nor is there a right to litigate against on a right to water that doesn't exist. So it was interesting here, especially to look at the power of the international right to water, which also doesn't exist as a legally binding thing in the US. So the power to is the power to act. And of course, in both these cases, and I'm just going to focus on Detroit for the purpose of time. So there you found that, of course, not only did people use that as a way to litigate, but also to protest, to organize. You can't discount the fact that rights allowed people to organize and to protest and to mobilize around the water disconnections, which in Detroit were basically to overwhelmingly Black households for failure to be able to pay their water bills. Then I found confirmation from the interlocutors about power within. What is power within? Power within is effectively, it's about activation, conscientization, effectively transforming a violation into, or something negative into an idea around action, into an idea around the violation being part of something bigger. So in terms of the conscientization, what you saw was that one of the activists said that they used rights to advocate and educate. And one of the key interlocutors, a community rights organization, she said that, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is used to conscientize people and to open people's minds. So there I saw confirmation of power within. Then in terms of the power with is effectively about alliance building. And there you saw an incredible amount of evidence to suggest that activists used the international right to water specifically in order to build alliances, to have a baseline of a common ground. And they spoke, what happened in Detroit, in fact, is that 3 UN special rapporteurs on poverty, on housing, and on water all came to Detroit. And all there was a lot of mobilization and alliance building around the fact that this disconnection due to inability to pay for water was a human rights issue and a human rights violation. And everybody spoke about this alliance building power of the international human rights machinery and the alliances that were built around it. So that's where the power cube gets you to. But I found, and it took me a long time to work through this, I found that there was something even less tangible but potentially more powerful in what people were saying about mobilizing around the right to water. And I've called it power from. And so this is my sort of modest contribution to the power cube. And it's actually hard to articulate, but what I said that this is about is it's something in this paradox that Wendy Brown points to about rights, that rights can be a trap because they inscribe your suffering. And you can get stuck in that moment. You can end up as an oppressed person, as a victim in a box. However, there is some latent potential, some real potential power in this inscribing of suffering, in that by showing you your exclusion, your suffering, the violation, you are also pointing to the untenability of that situation against the included, the privileged, the empowered. And in that, you've got a paradoxical situation, and I guess it comes back to the that's maxim that's wrongly attributed to Gramsci about essentially about power and contradiction, no progress about contradiction without contradiction, which apparently was actually Frederick Douglass, not Antonio Gramsci. But it's this thing about no progress without contradiction, this thing about the paradox and the power of the paradox, which I saw time and time again in the activists. And where it comes out, and what that does, I think, in terms of the power from the way I saw it, coming from the words of the people I spoke to, was that where rights highlight subordination, the language of rights affirms the untenability and injustice of exclusion in the present and articulates the conditions and contours of inclusion and justice in the future. In other words, part of the power of rights, what I'm calling the power from, is their emancipatory potential not only as instruments or even as static ends, but as articulating what equality and freedom might look like. And through that instantiation, providing a way of reframing the debate and resisting hegemonic power, as well as universally applicable visions for change. So it's in this kind of imagination of an alternative that I think rights have the most power. And in the 1 minute I have left, just to use some of the words that for me confirmed this, or I should say that gave me this idea in the first place from the activists that I spoke to. So one of the activists said that using the water rights language was critical in recasting the water disconnection problem as a human crisis. And this is very important in the US context, where poverty is often seen as the person's fault, that they've done something wrong, that they've been lazy, or etc. So recasting this as a human rights violation was absolutely critical. That it's transformed people from effectively reframing the communities in Detroit as citizens and political actors rather than only as consumers of water and as irresponsible consumers of water. Highlighting and the reframing role that Water Right played, one of my interlocutors spoke of the importance of legal mobilization in providing a counter-narrative to the prevailing paradigm of blaming poor people for hardships, denying structural problems, and trivializing their suffering. In another activist's words, living in Detroit is like living in a bubble of lies and madness with nothing to hold on to. People often feel like they are being stifled by not being heard, whereas human rights, including the right to water, offer a better vision and hope, a good model, showing that the rest of the world lives like human beings. So I'll end there. Thank you.
So thank you, Jackie and Catalina and everybody else on the panel. I'd like to open the floor to questions. There's a microphone down here if you wish to use that. Thank you.
Thank you all. It was a really super panel. And I have a question which links some to the previous panel and a bit to Architect, what you were talking about, the bureaucratic domain and the importance of the technical bureaucratic domain. And it's to do with, who measures what pollution is and what's kind of the legal standards, or the maneuverability around measurement of pollution, even the viability of rivers. And kind of, I'm thinking here of questions about baselines and the experiments that there have been and are all over the place about community monitoring of water pollution and kind of how that stands up or doesn't stand up in court. And linked to that, kind of where is impact measured on a river, right? I mean, is the pollution because you've got a mine next to a community, or is it downstream, or is it cross-border? Some of the issues between Guatemala and El Salvador about mining, for example, and the impact on rivers are a cross-border one. So yeah, kind of how and where, and your reflections on that, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Yep.
I have a question about, well, it's related to the implementation aspect that Catalina mentioned a couple of panels before, and this one was touched upon too. So you have a question like, if you saw in the cases, whether you saw in the cases community management of water, because it makes a big difference when you talk about the international human right to water, but then think about like how in the administrative law is gonna like land, right? Then you also need to think about who are the people who are going to be in charge of that. And one possibility from the participatory framework that we can play with or imagine is like how you grant or not community management of water and the community management or the communitarian implementation of a judicial ruling, blah, blah, blah. So I was wondering if you could take a look at that, and also like thinking about in Mexico, there's like this initiative of new law of water. And the main point of that law that has been created and pushed by social organizations like civil society and then rural communities is community management, because that's the way in which they can see a tool to like have a more power, basically. So like in your power idea, Jackie, that's the way in which social society and communities are finding to have more access and just more power before the state.
Thank you. You want a question too? These three? Okay, so we'll take the last three questions here and then we'll let the panel loose.
Thank you. Thanks for this interesting panel. I just have two questions. When you were talking, I was remembering the story that you know well about the construction of social and economic rights as fundamental rights. And so this question, is it linked to life or is it an autonomous rights and all the things you know? And I was wondering whether like what are the differences or the things we can learn from that process, and if there's something we can apply here into this process. And the other thing I was like, I know it's something that you and we are kind of building still, but I was thinking if you can talk a little bit about like this difference between, elaborate a bit more on the individual right to water and that collective right to water, and are there in contradiction? Well, I was more like a clarification on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Quickly for the last two, and then you guys are going to speak very quickly.
Yeah, thank you. So I have also two questions. One is about the Rio Atrato case. For what I understand, the Afro-descendant communities and indigenous communities did not ask for the recognition of subjectivity of the Atrato River, but the court recognized it anyway. So I was wondering if you also talked to them to understand what were their reactions to this decision, if they were all positive or I don't know. And another question about the water rights in India. I've read a very interesting article about litigation in India in relation to water rights, and it said that one problem is that during droughts, the most rich households tend to get control over water resources, and I was wondering whether there is also some litigation on that in India. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question.
Thank you. Thank you for the interesting presentation. So John Andrews, you very correctly pointed out that in the past, and particularly in Roman age, legal creativity was used to solve problems. And I'm wondering these days in current societies, how much space is there for legal creativity and legal fiction to solve problems? And particularly, I'm thrilled about the idea of these courts that currently are creating new mechanisms to protect nature differently from a time when the positivistic attitude did not consent to those institutions to create to legal creativity. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent questions. Why don't we start at Jackie's end? You got like just a little bit more than a minute each to answer all of these questions.
It'll go on. No, I don't think so. Thank you. Oh, now it wants to go on. Rejected. The less I say about that, the better. So I would just say something about the last point, which is that I think we are in a moment, maybe humanity is always in a crisis, and I'm speaking, of course, in an anthropocentric way as a human being. But I think that we really are in a moment where we can't avoid creativity. I think we have to use whatever tool we can. And I think, actually, I was really interested in hearing about this Italian case where the litigants are posing a 92% reduction in emissions from Italy, which they know full well they're not going to get. But it is absolutely essential that we try everything. And for me, I think that rights and the law is part of arsenal. It's all about shifting power, and we use what we can. And that's what I try to show now. We may fail in court, but it doesn't mean that we fail, and struggle is perpetual.
Okay, I'm going to take maybe two of the questions. Tatiana's comment on community-based water plants or acueductos comunitarios. It was very interesting. So when we were conducting interviews in Colombia about the importance or the effects or the impact of the international resolution in Colombia, all of them basically said, no, it's not really important, it's our mobilization for water. But when we talk to community-based organizations, like community-based water pipes or water acueductos comunitarios, whatever that is in English, they say, what? So they were very angry about the state taking credit for the human right to water. They said, we have provided water. We have granted human right to water to our community, to ourselves and to our community, because the state has never been here, has never been around. So of course the human right to water exists, and it's because of us. So they they felt threatened by this resolution, because now all their work was going to be credited to the Colombian state for providing or granting the human right to water. So, and I thought that was very interesting. So they have very, very important mobilization, and they were key in the referendum, the water referendum in Colombia, which didn't pass in Congress, but gained a lot of mobilization for a minimum free amount of water for everyone, and for it not to be privatized by corporations. And also now they are struggling for they call it ley propia, to regulate the community-based aqueducts as well. And the other point is about the individual and collective aspect of the rights. So it's not that there are two different rights. So as Sarkaja mentioned, the right to water is ambiguous, or it could be ambiguous, and then the communities fill it with content according to what they want and they need. But it can have many different connotations. No, it can be very useful for the corporations to sell water to everyone, and it can be useful for the community to have a free service, because this is connected to life and health. So it's not there are not two different rights, but there can be two different interpretations or content to the right. And when there are processes for enshrining the right to water in constitutions, then there is dispute and debate over what should be the content of the human right to water, and it's not it's contended.
Thank you. Try to keep you're standing between them and coffee, so.
So quickly, lots of different points, and I don't have very direct answers to some of them. I'll go about it in a slightly roundabout way, which answers several questions. But first of all, I think much more work needs to, of course, be done on this this business of measurement, the engineering standards, and we had long conversations about it in the last few days. But this kind of the relationship between society and engineering standards and law is very insufficient. It's also very, even in places where it looks like a lot, it doesn't answer, a lot of basic questions. But it's also in countries like mine, it's also quite insufficiently developed, and it's, how much of it is real. So, of course, that needs to be done. It was also really interesting to me, the first version of Jackie's paper on day zero that I read. I found it really interesting how the kind of the legal and policy and even the sort of technical paraphernalia of the right to water, the South African right to water, and the South African water governance frame was deployed in the management of day zero. It provided a kind of clarity of strategy that might not have been available otherwise. It gave the municipality actually a lot of power, which they wouldn't have had otherwise. And that was it. It was just interesting how the whole thing changed, and how climate change makes you think of things a bit differently. And it's it's time to think of those things differently. Yes, Bruce, I will rush along. And the last thing about the question about regulation and about this kind of economic pricing, the challenge about land, and the challenge about natural resources and drinking water. I started out even in myself thinking that the right to water was, about drinking water. But then as I, went deeper into the subject, I, started to see how much the right to water is not actually so restrictive, and, holds within it the possibility to resolve some of these kind of where the contentions are. But so, in many different ways, not always positive, sometimes negative, it has been deployed in different ways in different situations, not always successfully either, but it, has the possibility to have many meanings and many practical applications.
Well, yeah, I just want to address one of the Rachel's questions about pollution. And actually, it's because the Constitutional Court in Costa Rica, at the beginning, when it was created, was very open, and most of the pollution cases on water were in favor, because they call with this argument of in dubio pro natura. If it is some doubt, is going to be in favor of the nature. But now it closes a lot its vision, and they are rejecting pollution cases because they said explicitly that they have not enough technical evidence to see whether the water is polluted or not. So they send all these cases to the administrative jurisdiction, and they take 10, 15 years to be solved. And that's a problem, because in these 10 years, the community still has this problem. So that's a huge topic for us. And just to say that in the community management water providers that you could see in the map, we are like the kingdom is more than 2,050 providers, community providers, and there are by their own pretty much, because it's impossible to regulate it in practice to see whether the quality is fulfilling the legal requirements. But also the other thing is that more recently there have been corruption scandals in these community providers, because they are pretty much free to do whatever they want to, and then they even sell to hotels or bigger developments the right to have water. Just
I'll try and be quick, and I'll only address those questions that are that are closest to me. So that's you guys. And I'll take you both, one leading the last, leading to the first. I mean, law clearly can inspire, right? There's a lot of inspiration that's coming out of law, has always been an inspiration for new thinking. But we also recognize as well that this new thinking these are fictions, right? They are fictions. Law is a fiction, politics is a fiction, economy is a fiction, identity is a fiction, and so on. So there are multiple fictions, all of which can be inspiring of change and transformation, which is of value to us. But there is a concern here that has to be also raised with also individuals' projects. What we're seeing, for example, with these cases on the rights of rivers, is that they are not entirely. They're driven by local community concerns and interests. There's no doubt that lies behind them, but they're also driven as well by the egos and by the sort of intellectual stimulus of judges and key kind of legal people, court clerks, etc., that have aspiration to transform. And that sometimes that aspiration to transform is out of contact with the ground. And so that's part of what we're also unfortunately seeing as well in these cases. There's not enough embedding or foundation of these legal cases in the actual political, economic, social realities of the context in which they're being implemented. That is certainly the case when we come to the Trato case. So you mentioned, for example, the Trato case where there was that people in their case, which was launched as a human rights case, they were not asking for the subjectivity of the river. That is completely correct. They were not asking for the subjectivity of the river. They were very pleased, however, that there was a recognition of their wider relationship with the river and also the construction of this idea of biocultural rights. This is something that the guardians, this structure of governance that's been formed, has very much rallied around. But there is also recognition that it is still out of step with the political realities, the economic realities of that region, the Choco. Where there is still a real problem of, despite the existence of this ruling, of actually gaining any real traction, of actually gaining any real transformation in the socio-economic conditions of the populace, particularly the Afro-descendant and indigenous populations. And so when we talked to guardians and did interviews with them, one of the things that they very clearly emphasized was, look, this is just one more step. This is one more step in a long, long history of pushing at the doors of power. This is just another way of trying to get some recognition for our community. It's great that we've got recognition, partial recognition of our community and of our understanding of the relationship to the natural world, but this has to lead in a direction of change as well. And so there's a lack of recognition of that political and economic context. And that's a danger, I think, that we would recognize as well from other legal changes as well.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Jackie, Catalina, Arkaja, Evelyn, and John Andrew McNeish. And thank you for the questions. Thank you for being a good audience.